The insurgents expected to find terrified support staff when they breached Forward Operating Base Nightingale on that sunny Tuesday morning. What they found instead was Bronte Robinson, a 23-year-old weapons maintenance specialist from Manchester, surrounded by disassembled rifle parts and cleaning solvents. They thought they'd cornered easy prey. They had no idea that the quiet woman they dismissed as just another support technician had been preparing for this exact moment for over a year. By the time the smoke cleared and reinforcements arrived, the insurgents would learn why you should never underestimate someone who knows weapons better than the soldiers who carry them. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. Bronte Robinson had been assigned to weapons maintenance at Forward Operating Base Nightingale for 14 months, and every single day felt exactly the same. At 05:30 hours, she'd arrive at the armory before anyone else, her small frame barely casting a shadow in the pre-dawn darkness. The base, situated in the harsh mountains of Eastern Europe where NATO forces maintained a strategic presence, operated on precision timing, but Bronte always arrived early. She stood barely 5'3" and weighed perhaps 115 pounds, her auburn hair always pulled back in regulation style, her green eyes sharp with intelligence that most people never bothered to notice. The other soldiers at Nightingale had nicknamed her Tinker, not maliciously, but with the casual dismissal reserved for people whose jobs seemed more technical than tactical. While her colleagues prepared for patrol missions, convoy escorts, and reconnaissance operations, Bronte cleaned rifles. The irony wasn't lost on her. She probably knew more about the M4 carbines, M249 light machine guns, and M240B crew-served weapons than anyone on the base, including the weapons sergeants who supervised her work. She could strip down an M16 blindfolded in under 2 minutes, diagnose mechanical failures that left others baffled, and had developed her own maintenance protocols that extended weapon life by 30%. But when mission briefings were conducted, when dangerous assignments were distributed, when the real work of soldiering happened, Bronte Robinson was invisible. Her day began with the pre-inspection routine. She'd walk through the armory, checking humidity levels, examining storage conditions, and reviewing the previous day's maintenance logs. The weapons were her responsibility, ensuring they were clean, functional, and ready for deployment. It was critical work that kept soldiers alive, but it was also solitary work that kept her isolated from the camaraderie and respect that came with frontline duties. Bronte had joined the British Army with dreams that extended far beyond cleaning rifles. She'd scored exceptionally high on her mechanical aptitude tests, had completed advanced marksmanship training with honors, and had specifically requested assignment to combat units. Instead, she'd been channeled into weapons maintenance, a specialty that utilized her technical skills while keeping her safely away from actual combat operations. The frustration had built slowly over her 14 months at Nightingale. She'd watched as less qualified soldiers received opportunities for advancement, for specialized training, for the kind of meaningful assignments that built military careers. Meanwhile, she remained in the armory, surrounded by the tools of war, but never permitted to use them for their intended purpose. What made it worse was that she could see the flaws in base security, the gaps in defensive planning, the tactical mistakes that could prove costly. During her quiet hours in the armory, she'd studied base layouts, memorized patrol schedules, and identified vulnerabilities that concerned her deeply. But who was going to listen to observations from someone whose job was cleaning rifles? Her suggestions had been politely dismissed, her concerns filed away under administrative matters rather than tactical intelligence. The truth was that Bronte Robinson had spent 14 months preparing for war while everyone around her assumed she was simply maintaining equipment. She'd used her access to the armory to become intimately familiar with every weapon system on the base. She'd studied tactical manuals during her off-duty hours, had practiced scenarios in her mind while her hands performed the routine work of cleaning and maintenance.
Forward Operating Base Nightingale, perched on a strategic plateau in the Carpathian Mountains, its position chosen for the commanding view it provided over 3 major valley approaches. The base housed approximately 400 NATO personnel from a dozen different countries, creating a complex operational environment where coordination and communication were constantly challenging. The facility itself was a study in military efficiency, built around the principle of defensive depth. The outer perimeter consisted of reinforced concrete barriers, razor wire, and electronic surveillance systems. Guard towers positioned at each corner provided overlapping fields of fire, while the main gate was protected by a series of checkpoint barriers designed to prevent vehicle-borne attacks. Inside the perimeter, the base was organized into distinct functional areas. The command center occupied the most protected position at the facility's heart, surrounded by communications equipment and reinforced against both direct assault and electronic interference. The barracks areas housed personnel from different nations in separate compounds, each with its own mess facilities and recreational areas. The armory where Bronte worked was positioned in the base's eastern sector, a location chosen for security rather than convenience. The building was constructed with reinforced concrete walls and specialized ventilation systems designed to handle the chemicals and solvents required for weapons maintenance. Inside, weapons were stored in climate-controlled racks with separate areas for different types of equipment and ammunition. Bronte's workspace was a testament to organization and efficiency. Every tool had its designated place, every cleaning solution was properly labeled and stored, every maintenance record was meticulously documented. She'd created systems that went beyond standard military protocols, implementing procedures that maximized both weapon reliability and maintenance efficiency. The base operated on a rotation schedule that brought different units through Nightingale for varying periods. Some were permanently stationed there, like the command staff and support personnel. Others rotated through on 3-month deployments, bringing their own equipment and protocols before moving on to other assignments. This constant flow of personnel created ongoing challenges for someone responsible for maintaining weapons from multiple military traditions and manufacturers. Bronte had learned to work with equipment from American, German, British, and French military inventories, each with its own specifications, procedures, and quirks. She'd become a walking encyclopedia of weapons knowledge, capable of diagnosing problems and implementing solutions for systems that many soldiers had never seen before. The base's mission was officially described as Regional Stability Operations, which translated to a complex mix of patrol missions, liaison work with local authorities, and intelligence gathering. The men and women who conducted these operations depended entirely on Bronte's work to ensure their weapons functioned flawlessly when lives were on the line. Yet despite the critical nature of her responsibilities, Bronte remained largely invisible to the operational side of the base. She worked in the shadows, her contributions acknowledged only when something went wrong. The success of countless missions depended on her expertise, but success was measured in terms of patrol leaders and squad commanders, not the technician who ensured their weapons fired when needed. The mountain environment created additional challenges for weapons maintenance. Temperature variations between day and night were extreme, creating condensation problems that could cause corrosion and mechanical failures. Dust from the rocky terrain found its way into every mechanism, requiring constant attention and specialized cleaning procedures. The high altitude affected ballistics and mechanical performance in ways that required constant adjustment and calibration. Bronte had mastered all of these environmental factors, developing maintenance protocols specifically adapted to Nightingale's unique conditions. Her innovations had significantly reduced weapon failures and extended equipment life, improvements that directly translated into enhanced mission effectiveness and soldier safety. But innovations in weapons maintenance didn't earn commendations or recognition. They were simply expected to work, and when they did, no one remembered who made it possible.
The morning briefing on March 15th started like every other briefing Bronte had attended in her 14 months at Nightingale. Major Harrison stood at the front of the command center, his weathered face serious as he addressed the assembled personnel. Maps of the surrounding valleys covered the walls, marked with patrol routes, checkpoint locations, and intelligence updates from the previous 24 hours. Bronte sat in the back row, her notebook open, though she already knew her role in whatever operations were being planned. While patrol leaders, squad commanders, and specialists received their assignments, she would be told to ensure their weapons were ready. It was important work, but it wasn't the kind of work that earned respect or recognition. Intelligence indicates increased insurgent activity in Sectors 4 and 7, Major Harrison announced, his weathered face serious as he addressed the assembled personnel. Maps of the surrounding valleys covered the walls, marked with patrol routes, checkpoint locations, and intelligence updates from the previous 24 hours. Bronte sat in the back row, her notebook open, though she already knew her role in whatever operations were being planned. While patrol leaders, squad commanders, and specialists received their assignments, she would be told to ensure their weapons were ready. It was important work, but it wasn't the kind of work that earned respect or recognition. Intelligence indicates increased insurgent activity in Sectors 4 and 7, Major Harrison announced, his pointer tracing routes on the digital display. We're implementing enhanced patrol protocols and establishing temporary observation posts at key elevation points. Bronte listened carefully, her mind automatically analyzing the tactical implications. The sectors Harrison mentioned were accessible through 3 main approaches, each offering different advantages for hostile forces. She'd studied these routes extensively during her off-duty hours, had identified potential ambush sites and defensive positions that could prove critical in an engagement. As Harrison began assigning responsibilities, Bronte felt the familiar weight of anticipation and disappointment. Lieutenant Morrison, you'll lead the Northern Patrol. Sergeant Davies, you're responsible for the eastern approach. Corporal Williams, establish the observation post at grid reference 347521. Each assignment was met with crisp acknowledgments from personnel who would spend their day conducting meaningful military operations. They would gather intelligence, establish security, and potentially engage hostile forces. Their work would be documented in after-action reports, would contribute to their military records, and would build toward career advancement. Robinson, Harrison's voice cut through her thoughts. Ensure all patrol weapons are properly maintained and ready for deployment. I want function checks completed on all M4s and M249s assigned to today's operations. Yes, sir, Bronte replied, her voice steady despite the frustration building in her chest. Around her, the assigned personnel began discussing coordination details, communication protocols, and contingency planning. She gathered her notes and prepared to return to the armory, where she would spend another day preparing other soldiers for missions she would never be permitted to join. The walk back to her workspace gave her time to process the tactical information she'd absorbed during the briefing. The increased insurgent activity wasn't surprising. She'd noticed patterns in the intelligence reports that suggested a coordinated effort to probe base defenses. The patrol routes Harrison chosen were logical but predictable, following established patterns that any competent enemy force could anticipate. In the armory, Bronte began her routine inspection of the weapons assigned to today's patrols. Each rifle received a complete function check, every magazine was inspected for proper spring tension, and all optical sights were verified for zero and clarity. It was meticulous work that required both technical knowledge and attention to detail. As she worked, soldiers began arriving to collect their assigned weapons. She watched them sign equipment logs, conduct their own brief inspections, and discuss the day's missions among themselves. They treated her with professional courtesy, but little genuine interest. She was part of the support infrastructure, like the mechanics who maintained vehicles, or the communications technicians who operated radios. "Thanks, Tinker," Corporal Williams said as he signed for his squad's weapons. "Everything looks good as always." The nickname had stuck months ago, a reference to her constant tinkering with equipment and procedures. It wasn't meant to be insulting, but it reinforced her position as someone who worked with tools rather than someone who used them for their intended purpose. What frustrated Bronte most was watching soldiers who understood their weapons less than she did receive assignments that utilized those same weapons in combat situations. She'd seen maintenance requests that revealed fundamental gaps in understanding about weapon capabilities and limitations. She'd corrected tactical assumptions that could have proven dangerous in actual engagements. But her expertise was valued only within the narrow confines of the armory. Beyond those walls, her observations and insights were considered outside her area of responsibility. The military's rigid hierarchy meant that technical knowledge didn't translate to tactical authority, and her role as a support specialist limited her input to matters of maintenance and supply. By midday, all patrol weapons had been distributed and the base had settled into its operational rhythm. Bronte returned to her ongoing maintenance projects, working on weapons that would be needed for future missions. The work was absorbing, but lonely, carried out in the quiet efficiency of the armory, while the real business of soldiering happened elsewhere. The opportunity Bronte had been waiting for arrived disguised as routine paperwork. Captain Mueller from the German contingent approached her workstation with a requisition form and an expression that suggested he was doing her a favor by even acknowledging her existence. "Robinson, we need a technical assessment of the new HK-416 rifles that arrived last week," Mueller said, placing the form on her workbench. "Command wants to know if they're suitable for integration into our standard patrol loadout." Bronte's pulse quickened. This was exactly the kind of assignment she'd been hoping for, an opportunity to contribute technical expertise to operational planning. The HK-416 was a sophisticated weapon system that she'd studied extensively, and she had strong opinions about its tactical applications in Nightingale's operational environment. "I'll need to conduct firing tests to evaluate performance under local conditions," she replied, already mentally planning the assessment procedures. "The altitude and temperature variations here can significantly affect gas system performance and accuracy." Mueller nodded absently, clearly more interested in completing the paperwork than understanding the technical details. "Just submit your written assessment by Friday. Command needs the information for next week's equipment review." Bronte spent the next 3 days conducting the most comprehensive weapons evaluation of her career. She tested the HK-416 under various conditions, documented its performance characteristics, and prepared a detailed analysis that addressed every aspect of its tactical employment. Her report included recommendations for ammunition selection, maintenance schedules, and training requirements that would maximize the weapon's effectiveness. When Friday arrived, she submitted a 20-page technical assessment that represented some of the finest analytical work she'd ever produced. The report was thorough, professional, and demonstrated a level of expertise that went beyond routine maintenance responsibilities. The following Monday, she learned what had happened to her work. "The equipment review went well," she overheard Lieutenant Morrison telling Sergeant Davies near the mess hall. "Mueller's recommendation to adopt the HK-416 as our standard patrol weapon was approved by command." Bronte stopped walking, her coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. Mueller's recommendation? She'd written every word of that assessment, had conducted every test, had developed every conclusion that led to the adoption decision. "What did Mueller base his recommendation on?" Davies asked. "Technical evaluation by the weapons section," Mueller replied. "Apparently they did extensive testing and found the HK-416 superior to our current M4 configuration. Mueller's got good technical instincts." Bronte felt something cold settle in her stomach. Her work had been absorbed into Mueller's report without attribution, her expertise credited to the weapons section as if she were just another piece of equipment rather than the person who'd conducted the analysis. She approached Mueller later that day, finding him in the command center reviewing patrol schedules. "Captain, I wanted to follow up on the HK-416 assessment," she said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "Oh, right. Good work on that. Command was impressed with the thoroughness of the evaluation."
The report I submitted was 20 pages of detailed analysis. I noticed the final recommendation didn't include my name or signature. Mueller finally looked at her, his expression suggesting mild confusion about why this would matter. Robinson, you're support personnel. When technical evaluations are submitted to command, they come through the appropriate chain of command. I'm responsible for all weapons-related recommendations from this unit. But I conducted the evaluation. I wrote the analysis. I developed the recommendations. And you did good work, Mueller acknowledged, but the final decision authority rests with commissioned officers. Your technical input is valuable, but it needs to be properly channeled through command structure. Bronte realized she was watching her expertise being systematically erased from the record. Her analysis would influence tactical decisions, would affect how soldiers thought and survived, but her contribution would be invisible to anyone who mattered. Sir, I'd like to request assignment to the team that will implement the HK-416 training program, she said, making one last attempt to participate in the operational side of her technical work. Mueller's expression shifted to something approaching sympathy. Robinson, that's not your role. Training implementation requires instructional experience and tactical background that support personnel don't typically possess. We'll handle the operational side. You just keep the weapons clean and functional. The dismissal was complete. Her expertise was valuable enough to steal, but not valuable enough to acknowledge. Her knowledge was sophisticated enough to influence major equipment decisions, but not sufficient to earn her a seat at the table where those decisions were implemented. That evening, Bronte sat in her quarters staring at the copy of her original 20-page assessment. Every recommendation that command had adopted, every insight that would improve soldier effectiveness, every innovation that would save lives, all of it attributed to others, all of it disconnected from her name and reputation. She'd proven her expertise beyond question, but expertise without recognition was just another form of invisibility. The military structure had a place for her technical skills, but no room for her tactical understanding. She could influence decisions, but never receive credit for making them. The worst part was knowing that this pattern would continue indefinitely. Her knowledge would grow, her insights would prove valuable, and her contributions would be absorbed into the achievements of others who happened to wear the right rank or hold the right position.
The conversation that shattered Bronte's remaining illusions happened on a Thursday evening when she was working late in the armory. She'd stayed after normal hours to complete maintenance on the HK-416 rifles that were being distributed based on her uncredited analysis. The building was quiet, and she assumed she was alone until voices from the adjacent storage room made her freeze. "I'm just saying, giving Robinson that weapons assessment was a waste of time," she heard Captain Mueller's voice through the thin wall. "We could have saved 3 days and just gone with the standard procurement recommendation." But didn't her analysis prove pretty valuable? This was Lieutenant Morrison's voice, and Bronte felt a moment of hope that someone had recognized her contribution. "Look, Robinson knows her way around a cleaning kit, I'll give her that," Mueller replied with a laugh that made Bronte's stomach clench. "But these technical types always overcomplicate things. 20 pages of analysis for what any experienced soldier could tell you in 20 minutes. "Still, Command seemed impressed with the thoroughness," Morrison persisted. "Command was impressed with my presentation of the findings," Mueller corrected. "There's a difference between having technical knowledge and understanding how to apply it operationally. Robinson can tell you everything about how a weapon works, but she's never had to use one when someone's shooting back." Bronte's hands stopped moving on the rifle she was cleaning. She'd spent countless hours studying combat applications, had analyzed after-action reports from dozens of engagements, and had developed tactical insights that went beyond technical specifications. But none of that mattered to Mueller, who saw her as nothing more than a glorified janitor with access to manuals. "I heard she's been asking about tactical training opportunities, something about wanting to understand operational applications better." Mueller's laugh was sharper this time, edged with disbelief. "Morrison, can you imagine Robinson in an actual firefight? She's maybe 115 pounds soaking wet. The first time she tried to carry a wounded soldier, she'd collapse under the weight. There's a reason we keep certain people in support roles."
Physical size isn't everything, though, Morrison argued, though his tone suggested he was playing devil's advocate rather than defending her seriously. In this business, physics matters, Mueller replied firmly. I don't care how smart someone is or how well they know weapon specifications. When bullets start flying, you need people who can carry their weight, literally. Robinson's valuable in the armory because that's where her limitations don't matter. Put her in a combat situation, and she becomes a liability that someone else has to protect. Bronte's hands stopped moving on the rifle she was cleaning. She'd spent countless hours studying combat applications, had analyzed after-action reports from dozens of engagements, had developed technical insights that went beyond technical specifications. But none of that mattered to Mueller, who saw her as nothing more than a glorified janitor with access to manuals. I heard she's been asking about tactical training opportunities, something about wanting to understand operational applications better. Mueller's laugh was sharper this time, edged with disbelief. Morrison? Can you imagine Robinson in an actual firefight? She's maybe 115 pounds soaking wet. The first time she tried to carry a wounded soldier, she'd collapse under the weight. There's a reason we keep certain people in support roles. Physical size isn't everything, though, Morrison argued, though his tone suggested he was playing devil's advocate rather than defending her seriously. In this business, physics matters, Mueller replied firmly. I don't care how smart someone is or how well they know weapon specifications. When bullets start flying, you need people who can carry their weight, literally. Robinson's valuable in the armory because that's where her limitations don't matter. Put her in a combat situation, and she becomes a liability that someone else has to protect. Plus, Mueller continued, she's got that intense focus that works great for technical tasks, but would be a disaster in dynamic situations. Combat requires adaptability, split-second decisions, leadership under pressure. Robinson's the type who gets so focused on details that she misses the bigger picture. So you think she should just stick to maintenance work? Morrison asked. I think she should be grateful she's found a role where she can contribute meaningfully without getting herself or others killed, Mueller said bluntly. Not everyone is cut out for operational work, and there's no shame in that. The military needs people like Robinson doing exactly what she's doing now. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Bronte had heard enough. She sat in the quiet armory, surrounded by the weapons she knew better than anyone on the base, and absorbed the reality of how her colleagues truly perceived her. She wasn't seen as a soldier with untapped potential or underutilized skills. She was seen as someone whose physical and psychological limitations made her unsuitable for real military work. Her technical expertise was acknowledged but considered irrelevant to actual combat effectiveness. The most painful part was Mueller's assumption that she should be grateful for her limitations, that finding a role where her supposed weaknesses didn't matter was some kind of victory. He genuinely believed he was being reasonable, even generous, in acknowledging her technical contributions while keeping her safely away from situations where she might prove inadequate. Bronte finished her maintenance work in mechanical silence, her hands performing familiar tasks while her mind processed the conversation she had overheard. Every assumption Mueller had made about her capabilities, every limitation he identified, every reason he'd given for keeping her in her current role, she knew he was wrong about all of it. But knowing he was wrong and proving he was wrong were entirely different challenges. She'd been at Nightingale for 14 months, had demonstrated her technical expertise repeatedly, had contributed to successful operations in ways that no one bothered to document or acknowledge. Yet when experienced officers looked at her, they saw only her physical size, her support role, and their own assumptions about what those things meant for her potential. They couldn't imagine her succeeding in combat because they'd never seen her attempt it. They assumed she lacked the necessary attributes because those attributes weren't required for weapon maintenance.
What Captain Mueller and the others at Nightingale didn't know was that Bronte Robinson had been preparing for war since her first week at the base. While they saw someone content with cleaning weapons and filing maintenance reports, she had been systematically developing capabilities that went far beyond her assigned duties. Her preparation began with the base layout itself. During her first month at Nightingale,
Bronte had used her access to technical areas to create detailed mental maps of every building, corridor, and defensive position. She'd memorized the location of ammunition storage, communications equipment, and emergency supplies. She knew which doors required key cards, which windows provided fields of fire, and which structural elements could provide cover during an assault. This wasn't casual observation, it was systematic intelligence gathering, conducted with the methodical precision she brought to weapons maintenance. She'd timed patrol routes, noted security vulnerabilities, and identified tactical advantages that could prove critical in a defensive situation. Her official duties gave her legitimate reasons to access most areas of the base, and her quiet competence meant that no one questioned her presence anywhere. The weapons knowledge that Mueller dismissed as technical went far deeper than anyone realized. Bronte hadn't just studied maintenance manuals, she'd analyzed combat effectiveness data, ballistics performance, and tactical applications for every weapon system on the base. She knew which ammunition types performed best under different conditions, which weapons were most reliable in extreme temperatures, and how to modify equipment for specific tactical requirements. During her off-duty hours, she'd accessed online tactical training resources, studied urban warfare doctrine, and analyzed after-action reports from recent conflicts. She'd learned about small unit tactics, defensive positioning, and combat decision-making from sources that most support personnel never bothered to explore. Her physical preparation had been equally systematic but carefully hidden. The base gym was always busy during standard hours, filled with soldiers whose training was officially recognized and encouraged. Bronte worked out during off-peak times, focusing on functional fitness that would translate to combat effectiveness rather than general conditioning. She'd developed strength training routines specifically designed to improve her ability to handle weapons under stress, to move quickly while carrying equipment, and to maintain fine motor control during high-pressure situations. Her cardio work emphasized the kind of sustained effort required for extended engagements, while her flexibility training focused on the ability to shoot accurately from unusual positions. Most importantly, she'd been practicing with weapons in ways that went far beyond standard maintenance procedures. Using the legitimate requirement to test fire weapons after major maintenance, she'd developed shooting skills that would have surprised anyone who bothered to check her qualification scores. She could engage targets accurately at extended ranges, could transition between weapons quickly, and had developed an intuitive understanding of ballistics that came from hundreds of hours of practical application. Her marksmanship training had been conducted in complete secrecy, using authorization paperwork that appeared routine but actually covered extensive practice sessions. She'd tested different ammunition types, had practiced shooting under various environmental conditions, and had developed techniques for engaging multiple targets rapidly and accurately. The tactical knowledge that Mueller considered irrelevant had been built through careful study of combat footage, analysis of successful defensive actions, and detailed examination of base vulnerabilities. She'd identified likely attack routes, had planned defensive responses to various threat scenarios, and had developed contingency procedures for situations that official planning seemed to ignore. Her preparation included psychological conditioning as well. She'd studied stress management techniques used by special forces, had practiced decision-making under pressure, and had developed mental frameworks for maintaining effectiveness during chaotic situations. She understood that technical knowledge meant nothing without the ability to apply it when lives were at stake. What made her preparation particularly sophisticated was how completely she had hidden it from everyone around her. Her colleagues saw exactly what they expected to see: a dedicated technician who took her maintenance responsibilities seriously. They had no idea that she'd been systematically transforming herself into a combatant who understood both the technical and tactical aspects of warfare better than most soldiers they considered fully qualified. Bronte knew that her preparation might never be tested, that she might spend her entire deployment cleaning weapons while others fought battles. But she also knew that preparation was the only way to create opportunity, and that being ready when chance arrived was the difference between success and catastrophe. She'd spent 14 months proving herself within the limitations others had imposed on her, but she'd also spent 14 months preparing to shatter those limitations completely.
The first sign that Bronte's preparation hadn't gone completely unnoticed came during a routine security briefing in late March. Sergeant Williams from Base Security approached her workstation with a clipboard and an expression that suggested this wasn't a standard administrative visit. "Robinson, I need to ask you about your access patterns over the past few months," Williams said, settling into the chair across from her workbench. "Security protocols require periodic review of personnel movement, especially for those with access to sensitive areas." Bronte continued working on the rifle disassembly she'd been completing, her hands steady despite the sudden acceleration of her pulse. "Of course, Sergeant. What specific information do you need?" Williams consulted his notes, though Bronte suspected he'd already memorized the details he was about to discuss. "You've been accessing the ammunition storage area more frequently than typical for maintenance personnel. Care to explain why?" The question was reasonable on its surface, but Bronte recognized the underlying suspicion. Someone had been tracking her movements, had noticed patterns that extended beyond routine weapons maintenance. Her systematic preparation was beginning to attract the wrong kind of attention. "Ammunition testing is essential for proper weapons maintenance," she replied, keeping her voice professionally neutral. "Different lots can have varying performance characteristics that affect accuracy and reliability. I've been conducting more thorough testing to ensure optimal performance for patrol weapons." "Testing that requires access outside normal duty hours," Williams pressed. "Your card was scanned at the ammunition bunker at 21:30 hours last Tuesday. That seems unusual for routine maintenance." Bronte had anticipated this conversation eventually, had prepared explanations that would satisfy surface-level scrutiny while protecting her deeper activities. "The testing requires controlled conditions without interference from daily operations. Evening hours provide the quiet environment necessary for accurate data collection." Williams made notes on his clipboard, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with her explanations. "Robinson, I want to be clear that no one's questioning your dedication or competence. Your work has been exemplary, but there have been observations about your thoroughness." The euphemism carried implications that made Bronte's stomach tighten. Her systematic approach to preparation, the very qualities that made her effective, were being reframed as potential security concerns. Dedication became obsession, thoroughness became suspicious behavior. "What kind of observations?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Personnel have noticed that you spend considerable time studying tactical materials that aren't directly related to your assigned duties. Base layout memorization, patrol route analysis, defensive positioning studies. These activities raise questions about your focus and intentions." Bronte realized she was experiencing the military equivalent of being too prepared for the wrong reasons. Her expertise was acceptable within narrow limits, but exceeding those limits triggered suspicion rather than recognition. The same systematic approach that made her excellent at weapons maintenance made others question why she needed to know so much about topics outside her specialty. "Sergeant, understanding tactical applications helps me provide better technical support. If I know how weapons are being used, I can anticipate maintenance requirements and performance issues." "That's a reasonable explanation," Williams acknowledged, "but it doesn't account for the level of detail in your studies. Multiple personnel have commented on your knowledge of base security procedures, patrol schedules, and defensive capabilities. That goes beyond technical support." The investigation was more thorough than Bronte had expected. Someone had been systematically documenting her activities, had noticed the pattern of preparation that she'd thought was subtle enough to avoid detection. Her colleagues had been observing and reporting her behavior without her knowledge.
"Who exactly has been commenting on my activities?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would include Captain Mueller and others who'd already dismissed her tactical potential. "That's not relevant to this discussion," Williams replied. "What matters is ensuring that all personnel are focused on their assigned responsibilities and aren't developing unhealthy obsessions with duties outside their expertise." Unhealthy obsessions struck Bronte like a physical blow. Her careful preparation was being pathologized, treated as evidence of psychological instability rather than professional excellence. The same dedication that would be praised in combat personnel was being used to question her fitness for duty. "Sergeant, I want to be the best soldier I can be. If that means understanding how my work fits into the larger mission, then I'll continue studying whatever helps me serve more effectively." Williams softened slightly, though his clipboard remained ready for additional notes. "Robinson, no one's questioning your dedication or competence within your specialty, but the military functions because people stay within their assigned roles and trust others to handle different responsibilities. When someone starts reaching beyond their lane, it creates questions about judgment and priorities." The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, covering her training activities, her equipment access, and her interactions with operational personnel. Williams was professional but persistent, clearly working from a checklist of concerns that someone had compiled over weeks or months of observation. When he finally left, Bronte sat in the quiet armory and absorbed the reality of her situation. Her preparation had been noticed, cataloged, and was now being treated as a potential problem rather than a valuable asset. The very qualities that would make her effective in combat were being used to question her suitability for military service. She realized that her systematic approach to readiness had made her visible in exactly the wrong way. Instead of being seen as exceptionally prepared, she was being seen as inappropriately ambitious. Her knowledge was being treated as evidence of poor boundaries rather than superior dedication. The irony was that if she'd been assigned to combat duties, her preparation would have been considered exemplary. But because she was support personnel, the same preparation was being treated as suspicious and potentially problematic.
The formal meeting that would change everything took place in Major Harrison's office on a Tuesday morning that started with deceptive normalcy. Bronte had been summoned at 0800 hours, told only that command wanted to discuss her professional development and role clarity. The euphemistic language suggested trouble, but she'd hoped for the best while preparing for the worst. Harrison sat behind his desk with Captain Mueller to his right and Sergeant Williams to his left, creating a tribunal arrangement that immediately put Bronte on the defensive. Her service file lay open between them, and she could see highlighted sections that suggested this conversation had been planned in considerable detail. "Robinson," Harrison began, his tone carrying the weight of command authority, "we've asked you here to address concerns about your focus and role boundaries. Your technical competence has been consistently excellent, but there are questions about your understanding of appropriate scope and responsibility." Bronte sat straight in her chair, hands folded in her lap, projecting the professional composure that had served her well throughout her military career. "Sir, I'm committed to performing my duties to the highest standard possible." "That's part of what we need to discuss," Mueller interjected. "Your interpretation of highest standard seems to extend well beyond your assigned responsibilities. You've been conducting activities that raise questions about your focus and priorities." Harrison consulted the file, though Bronte suspected he'd already memorized its contents. "Robinson, you've been accessing tactical training materials, studying base security procedures, and developing knowledge in areas that fall outside your specialty. Can you explain why you believe this is appropriate use of your time and resources?" The question was phrased to make her preparation sound like misconduct rather than initiative. Bronte had rehearsed various responses to this line of questioning, but facing the actual tribunal made every explanation sound inadequate before she spoke.
Sir, I'm committed to performing my duties to the highest standard possible. That's part of what we need to discuss, Mueller interjected. Your interpretation of highest standard seems to extend well beyond your assigned responsibilities. You've been conducting activities that raise questions about your focus and priorities. Harrison consulted the file, though Bronte suspected he'd already memorized its contents. Robinson, you've been accessing tactical training materials, studying base security procedures, and developing knowledge in areas that fall outside your specialty. Can you explain why you believe this is appropriate use of your time and resources? The question was phrased to make her preparation sound like misconduct rather than initiative. Bronte had rehearsed various responses to this line of questioning, but facing the actual tribunal made every explanation sound inadequate before she spoke. Sir, I'm committed to performing my duties to the highest standard possible. That's part of what we need to discuss, Mueller interjected. Your interpretation of highest standard seems to extend well beyond your assigned responsibilities. You've been conducting activities that raise questions about your focus and priorities. Harrison consulted the file, though Bronte suspected he'd already memorized its contents. Robinson, you've been accessing tactical training materials, studying base security procedures, and developing knowledge in areas that fall outside your specialty. Can you explain why you believe this is appropriate use of your time and resources? The question was phrased to make her preparation sound like misconduct rather than initiative. Bronte had rehearsed various responses to this line of questioning, but facing the actual tribunal made every explanation sound inadequate before she spoke. Sir, I'm committed to performing my duties to the highest standard possible. That's part of what we need to discuss, Mueller interjected. Your interpretation of highest standard seems to extend well beyond your assigned responsibilities. You've been conducting activities that raise questions about your focus and priorities. Harrison consulted the file, though Bronte suspected he'd already memorized its contents. Robinson, you've been accessing tactical training materials, studying base security procedures, and developing knowledge in areas that fall outside your specialty. Can you explain why you believe this is appropriate use of your time and resources? The question was phrased to make her preparation sound like misconduct rather than initiative. Bronte had rehearsed various responses to this line of questioning, but facing the actual tribunal made every explanation sound inadequate before she spoke. Sir, I'm committed to performing my duties to the highest standard possible. That's part of what we need to discuss, Mueller interjected. Your interpretation of highest standard seems to extend well beyond your assigned responsibilities. You've been conducting activities that raise questions about your focus and priorities. Harrison consulted the file, though Bronte suspected he'd already memorized its contents. Robinson, you've been accessing tactical training materials, studying base security procedures, and developing knowledge in areas that fall outside your specialty. Can you explain why you believe this is appropriate use of your time and resources? The question was phrased to make her preparation sound like misconduct rather than initiative. Bronte had rehearsed various responses to this line of questioning, but facing the actual tribunal made every explanation sound inadequate before she spoke. Sir, I'm committed to performing my duties to the highest standard possible. That's part of what we need to discuss, Mueller interjected. Your interpretation of highest standard seems to extend well beyond your assigned responsibilities. You've been conducting activities that raise questions about your focus and priorities. Harrison consulted the file, though Bronte suspected he'd already memorized its contents. Robinson, you've been accessing tactical training materials, studying base security procedures, and developing knowledge in areas that fall outside your specialty. Can you explain why you believe this is appropriate use of your time and resources? The question was phrased to make her preparation sound like misconduct rather than initiative. Bronte had rehearsed various responses to this line of questioning, but facing the actual tribunal made every explanation sound inadequate before she spoke. "Sir, I'm committed to performing my duties to the highest standard possible." "That's part of what we need to discuss," Mueller interjected. "Your interpretation of highest standard seems to extend well beyond your assigned responsibilities. You've been conducting activities that raise questions about your focus and priorities." Harrison consulted the file, though Bronte suspected he'd already memorized its contents. "Robinson, you've been accessing tactical training materials, studying base security procedures, and developing knowledge in areas that fall outside your specialty. Can you explain why you believe this is appropriate use of your time and resources?" The question was phrased to make her preparation sound like misconduct rather than initiative. Bronte had rehearsed various responses to this line of questioning, but facing the actual tribunal made every explanation sound inadequate before she spoke. "Sir, I'm committed to performing my duties to the highest standard possible." "That's part of what we need to discuss," Mueller interjected. "Your interpretation of highest standard seems to extend well beyond your assigned responsibilities. You've been conducting activities that raise questions about your focus and priorities." Harrison consulted the file, though Bronte suspected he'd already memorized its contents. "Robinson, you've been accessing tactical training materials, studying base security procedures, and developing knowledge in areas that fall outside your specialty. Can you explain why you believe this is appropriate use of your time and resources?" The question was phrased to make her preparation sound like misconduct rather than initiative. Bronte had rehearsed various responses to this line of questioning, but facing the actual tribunal made every explanation sound inadequate before she spoke. "Sir, I'm committed to performing my duties to the highest standard possible." "That's part of what we need to discuss," Mueller interjected. "Your interpretation of highest standard seems to extend well beyond your assigned responsibilities. You've been conducting activities that raise questions about your focus and priorities." Harrison consulted the file, though Bronte suspected he'd already memorized its contents. "Robinson, you've been accessing tactical training materials, studying base security procedures, and developing knowledge in areas that fall outside your specialty. Can you explain why you believe this is appropriate use of your time and resources?" The question was phrased to make her preparation sound like misconduct rather than initiative. Bronte had rehearsed various responses to this line of questioning, but facing the actual tribunal made every explanation sound inadequate before she spoke. "Sir, I'm committed to performing my duties to the highest standard possible." "That's part of what we need to discuss," Mueller interjected. "Your interpretation of highest standard seems to extend well beyond your assigned responsibilities. You've been conducting activities that raise questions about..."
Tuesday, April 12th, began like every other day at Forward Operating Base Nightingale. The morning briefing covered routine patrol schedules, equipment maintenance requirements, and intelligence updates that suggested normal operational tempo. Major Harrison discussed weather conditions, personnel rotations, and administrative matters with the same professional efficiency that characterized every briefing Bronte had attended. She sat in her usual position at the back of the room, taking notes on weapons requirements and maintenance schedules. Since her formal limitation meeting 3 weeks earlier, she'd been relegated to purely technical duties. Her access to tactical materials had been restricted, her input on operational matters had been eliminated, and her role had been narrowed to basic weapons maintenance and inventory management. The restrictions had been enforced systematically. Williams checked her access logs weekly. Mueller reviewed her maintenance reports for any sign of tactical analysis, and Harrison monitored her activities to ensure compliance with the new boundaries.
She'd been effectively contained within the limits they'd established for her competence and responsibility. What none of them knew was that her preparation had been too thorough to simply shut down. The knowledge she'd acquired, the skills she'd developed, and the tactical understanding she'd built couldn't be erased by administrative restrictions. They could limit her access to new information, but they couldn't remove what she'd already learned. At 13:47 hours, while Bronte was conducting routine maintenance on patrol weapons, the base's early warning system activated with a shriek that cut through the afternoon quiet like a blade. The alert indicated incoming threats, possibly indirect fire or aircraft, and triggered immediate defensive protocols throughout Nightingale. Bronte dropped her cleaning tools and moved toward the armory's reinforced window, looking out toward the perimeter where guard towers were already scanning the surrounding terrain. The base's defensive systems were designed to detect and respond to various threats, but the specific nature of this alert wasn't immediately clear. The radio chatter from the command center, audible through the armory's communication system, provided fragments of information that painted an increasingly serious picture. Multiple contacts approaching from Sector 7, estimated strength unknown, rapid movement toward perimeter fence. Within minutes, the alert escalated from potential threat to confirmed attack. The insurgent force that intelligence had been tracking for weeks had finally moved against Nightingale, and they'd chosen their timing perfectly. Most of the base's patrol units were deployed on missions, leaving defensive capabilities at minimum levels. Bronte watched through the window as the first explosions erupted along the eastern perimeter, exactly where she'd identified vulnerabilities during her unauthorized tactical studies. The attackers had found the weak points in Nightingale's defenses, had exploited gaps that her analysis had predicted but that no one had wanted to hear about. The base's defensive response was immediate but insufficient. The reduced personnel strength meant that guard towers were understaffed, patrol units were too far away to provide immediate support, and the remaining soldiers were spread thin across multiple defensive positions. From her position in the armory, she could see the tactical situation developing exactly as her studies had suggested it might. The attackers were using terrain features she'd mapped, were approaching through routes she'd identified as vulnerable, and were exploiting weaknesses she'd documented in reports that had been dismissed as outside her area of expertise. The irony was bitter and immediate. Her tactical knowledge, the preparation that had been declared inappropriate and problematic, was proving to be exactly what the base needed. The scenarios she'd studied, the defensive plans she'd developed, the contingencies she'd prepared for, all of it was suddenly relevant in ways that her supervisors had refused to acknowledge. The radio traffic from the command center grew increasingly urgent as the situation deteriorated. Eastern perimeter has been breached. Multiple casualties at Guard Tower 3. Insurgents moving toward the command center. Bronte realized that the attackers weren't conducting a random assault. They were executing a coordinated plan designed to neutralize Nightingale's command and control capabilities, to decapitate the base's ability to coordinate defensive responses. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated attack that her analysis had identified as the most dangerous threat. Through the armory window, she could see muzzle flashes and smoke as firefights erupted across the base. The defenders were fighting bravely, but were clearly outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The base's defensive plan, designed for different threat scenarios, wasn't adequate for the coordinated assault they were facing. Major Harrison's voice crackled through the radio, calm but strained, as he attempted to coordinate the defense. All units, fall back to secondary positions, maintain communication, medical teams to the command bunker. But Bronte could see what Harrison couldn't from his position in the command center. The attackers had anticipated the fallback plan. were positioned to intercept defenders moving to secondary positions, and had effectively cut off the routes that the defensive plan relied on. The base was being systematically dismantled by an enemy force that understood Nightingale's weaknesses better than its own defenders did. The tactical knowledge that could have prevented this disaster had been dismissed. The preparation that could have made the difference had been declared inappropriate, and the person who had seen this coming had been told to stay within her assigned role. As explosions grew closer to the armory, Bronte faced a choice that would define everything that followed. She could follow orders, remain in her technical role, and watch the base fall to attackers she'd tried to warn everyone about. Or she could use the preparation they'd forbidden her to develop, could act on the knowledge they'd declared outside her expertise, and could prove that their assumptions about her capabilities were as wrong as their dismissal of her warnings. The choice was made for her when the armory door exploded inward and 3 insurgents stepped through the smoke, weapons raised and expressions confident as they prepared to secure what they assumed was an undefended technical facility. They'd found the weapons maintenance specialist they expected to find. What they hadn't expected was that she'd been preparing for this exact moment for over 14 months.
The 3 insurgents who entered the armory moved with the confidence of soldiers who expected to encounter terrified support personnel, not organized resistance. They wore mismatched tactical gear but carried their weapons with professional competence, and their coordinated entry suggested they'd done this before. The lead fighter swept his rifle toward the workbench where Bronte had been moments earlier, while his companions moved to secure the room's corners. What they found instead was empty space and the sound of their own breathing echoing in the sudden quiet. Bronte had disappeared with the kind of speed and efficiency that came from months of mental rehearsal for exactly this scenario. Her tactical preparation had included detailed planning for defending the armory, and she'd positioned herself in the blind spot she'd identified during her systematic study of the building's layout. From her concealed position behind the weapon storage racks, she could observe all 3 attackers while remaining invisible to their initial sweep. They were communicating through hand signals, indicating a level of training that confirmed her assessment of this as a sophisticated operation rather than a random attack. The lead insurgent moved toward the weapons storage area, clearly intent on securing the base's small arms and ammunition. His route would bring him within 3 feet of Bronte's position, close enough for her to act, but also close enough to be killed instantly if she misjudged the timing or execution. Bronte's hands moved to the disassembled rifle she'd been working on when the attack began. The HK-416 wasn't fully assembled, but she'd been in the middle of a complete maintenance cycle that left the major components readily available. Her 14 months of systematic preparation included the ability to reassemble weapons under stress, and she'd practiced this specific procedure until it became automatic. Working purely by touch, she connected the upper and lower receivers, inserted the bolt carrier group, and attached the charging handle in movements so practiced they required no conscious thought. The magazine she'd been testing was already loaded with 30 rounds of NATO 5.56mm ammunition, and she inserted it with the kind of smooth efficiency that comes from thousands of repetitions. The entire assembly process took 18 seconds, time that the insurgents spent moving through what they assumed was an empty room. They had no reason to expect resistance from a weapons maintenance facility, and their casual approach gave Bronte the opportunity she needed to prepare for what would follow. Her tactical knowledge told her that 3 trained fighters in an enclosed space represented an impossible challenge for a single defender, especially one who was supposedly unqualified for combat operations. The conventional wisdom said that she should surrender, should hope for mercy, should trust that others would handle the situation she couldn't possibly manage alone. But conventional wisdom had been wrong about her capabilities for 14 months, and she'd spent that time preparing for situations that others assumed she'd never face. The tactical scenarios she'd studied included exactly this kind of close-quarters engagement, and she developed responses based on principles that maximized her advantages while minimizing her physical disadvantages. The first advantage was surprise. The insurgents expected to find cowering support personnel, not someone prepared to fight back with professional competence.
Their psychological preparation was entirely wrong for the situation they were actually facing. The second advantage was knowledge. Bronte knew the armory's layout perfectly, could move through it in complete darkness, and had identified every piece of cover and concealment the room offered. The attackers were operating in unfamiliar territory with imperfect information. The third advantage was preparation. While they were improvising their approach to securing the room, she was executing plans she'd rehearsed mentally hundreds of times. Every movement she would make had been considered, practiced, and optimized for maximum effectiveness. As the lead insurgent approached her position, Bronte made the calculations that would determine whether her preparation had been adequate or whether her supervisors had been right about her limitations. The distance was 12 feet, the angle required a shot slightly upward, and she would have perhaps 2 seconds to engage before his companions could respond. Her breathing steadied automatically, the result of stress management techniques she'd practiced off-duty hours. Her grip on the HK-416 was exactly what her training had taught her, and her body position maximized stability while allowing for rapid movement after the initial engagement. The moment arrived with the suddenness that she'd trained herself to expect. The lead insurgent stepped into the gap between storage racks, his rifle lowered as he scanned for threats he didn't expect to find. Bronte rose from her concealed position with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed this movement until it became instinctive. Her first shot took him center mass from a distance of 8 feet, the HK-416's report echoing through the armory like thunder in a closed space. The insurgent dropped immediately, his weapon clattering across the concrete floor as his body followed. The other two fighters reacted with the trained responses she'd expected, pivoting toward the sound of gunfire while bringing their own weapons to bear. But Bronte was already moving, using the armory's layout to break their line of sight while maintaining her own tactical advantage. Her preparation had included detailed planning for multiple target engagements in confined spaces, and she executed those plans with the precision that came from systematic mental rehearsal. The second insurgent received 2 rounds to the chest before he could complete his turn, while the third managed to fire a burst that missed by inches before Bronte's return fire ended his threat. The entire engagement lasted less than 15 seconds. 3 trained fighters had been neutralized by someone who was supposedly unqualified for combat operations, using skills that had been declared inappropriate for her role and expertise that had been dismissed as outside her area of responsibility. As silence returned to the armory, broken only by the distant sounds of ongoing battle throughout the base, Bronte realized that her impossible challenge had just begun. She'd proven that her preparation was adequate for close-quarters combat, but the base was still under attack by forces that outnumbered the defenders significantly. Her tactical knowledge told her that the armory engagement was just the first phase of what would be a much larger test of everything she'd learned during her 14 months of unauthorized preparation.
The journey from the armory to the communications center required crossing terrain that had been transformed from familiar base geography into a combat zone where every shadow could conceal a threat. Bronte moved with the systematic precision she'd developed during months of mental rehearsal, using routes she'd mapped during her unauthorized tactical studies. Her first challenge came 50 meters from the armory, where she encountered 2 insurgents moving toward the base's fuel depot. They were operating with the confidence of soldiers who believed they controlled the battlefield, their attention focused on their objective rather than potential threats from unexpected directions. Bronte's approach utilized cover and concealment principles she'd studied during off-duty hours, moving through areas that provided protection while maintaining tactical advantage. Her engagement was swift and decisive, 2 precisely placed shots that neutralized both threats before they could raise an alarm or return fire. The tactical knowledge that Captain Mueller had dismissed as inappropriate guided every decision she made. Her movement patterns exploited blind spots in the insurgent positions, her timing avoided areas where enemy forces were concentrated, and her route selection maximized her ability to support defending personnel while minimizing exposure to return fire.
As she progressed across the base, Bronte encountered the devastating effectiveness of the enemy plan. Guard towers had been systematically destroyed, defensive positions had been overrun, and isolated groups of defenders were fighting desperate holding actions against superior numbers. At the maintenance shed, she found Corporal Williams and 2 other soldiers pinned down by fire from an elevated position they couldn't effectively engage. The tactical situation was exactly what her scenario planning had prepared her for. Defenders trapped by enemies who held superior positions and fields of fire. "Williams," she called out using hand signals she'd learned during her unauthorized tactical training. "Cover me for 30 seconds. I'm flanking their position." Williams looked up in shock, clearly not expecting to see the weapons maintenance specialist in the middle of a firefight. "Robinson, what the hell are you doing here? Get back to the armory." "The armory's secure," she replied, already moving toward the position she'd identified as optimal for engaging the elevated threat. "I'm going to neutralize their overwatch so you can move to better cover." Her flanking maneuver utilized terrain features she'd mapped months earlier, approaching the insurgent position from an angle they hadn't anticipated. The engagement required the kind of precision shooting she'd practiced during her secret training sessions, engaging targets at extended range while minimizing her own exposure. The 2 insurgents who had Williams pinned down fell to carefully aimed fire before they could adjust their positions to counter her unexpected approach. Williams and his team were able to move to more defensible positions, but their expressions suggested they were struggling to process seeing their technical specialist conducting combat operations with professional competence. "Williams," said as she rejoined his position, "where did you learn to do that?" "I've been preparing for this," she replied, checking her ammunition and scanning for additional threats. "The base's defensive plan has gaps that the insurgents are exploiting. We need to coordinate a more effective response." Her movement toward the communication center continued through a series of similar encounters. Each engagement followed patterns she'd studied, utilized tactics she'd developed, and demonstrated capabilities that her supervisors had declared impossible for someone in her position. At the motor pool, she encountered Sergeant Davies leading a group of soldiers who were attempting to reach the command bunker using a route that would expose them to prepared enemy positions. Her intervention redirected them through safer approaches that her tactical analysis had identified as viable alternatives. Near the mess hall, she provided covering fire for medical personnel who were attempting to reach wounded defenders in exposed positions. Her shooting was precise enough to suppress enemy fire without endangering the people she was protecting, demonstrating the kind of tactical sophistication that her training had developed. Throughout her journey, Bronte maintained radio contact with surviving units, providing tactical information that her unauthorized studies had made available. She guided defenders away from kill zones, identified safe movement routes, and coordinated activities that maximized their collective effectiveness. The soldiers she encountered responded to her leadership with increasing confidence as they realized that her tactical knowledge was keeping them alive. The weapons maintenance specialist they dismissed was proving more effective at combat operations than officers who'd been specifically trained for such responsibilities. Her approach to the communications center required navigating the most dangerous part of the base, where insurgent forces had concentrated their assault on command and control facilities. The final 200 meters would test every skill she'd developed during her months of preparation. Moving through smoke and intermittent fire, Bronte could see the communication building ahead. The facility was under siege, with defending personnel trapped inside while insurgent forces prepared for a final assault that would eliminate the base's remaining command capabilities. Her unauthorized tactical preparation had anticipated exactly this scenario, and she'd developed plans for relieving besieged positions using tactics that maximized individual effectiveness while minimizing risk to defending personnel. The time had come to prove that 14 months of forbidden preparation could accomplish what conventional military wisdom said was impossible. She was about to attempt something that would either validate everything she'd learned or demonstrate that her supervisors had been right about her limitations all along. As she prepared for the final approach, she realized that her solitary journey had already proven the most important point. The tactical knowledge that had been declared inappropriate was keeping people alive, and the capabilities that had been dismissed as unsuitable were making the difference between survival and disaster.
The final assault on the communications center required everything Bronte had learned during her 14 months of unauthorized preparation. The insurgent forces had positioned themselves to prevent any relief effort, creating overlapping fields of fire that would normally make approach impossible for individual soldiers. But Bronte's tactical analysis had identified a route that utilized the base's infrastructure in ways that enemy planning hadn't anticipated. Her approach took her through the utility tunnels she'd mapped during her systematic study of base vulnerabilities. The underground passages provided concealed movement to within 50 meters of the communications building, emerging in a position that placed her behind the main insurgent assault force. The engagement that followed demonstrated the tactical sophistication she'd developed through months of scenario planning and skill development. Using precision fire and coordinated movement, she systematically eliminated the threats that had trapped the defending personnel inside the communications center. Her success was measured not just in neutralized enemies, but in the survival of personnel who would have died without her intervention. The tactical knowledge that had been dismissed as inappropriate had proved to be exactly what the situation required. As the immediate threats were eliminated, the communications center's surviving personnel emerged to find their rescue had been accomplished by someone they'd assumed was unqualified for combat operations. The expressions on their faces reflected the same shock that had characterized every encounter during her journey across the base. "Robinson," Lieutenant Morrison said, his voice carrying disbelief as he surveyed the tactical situation she'd resolved. Where did you learn to do this?" "I've been preparing for it," she replied, conducting a systematic check of the area to ensure all threats had been neutralized. The defensive vulnerabilities were predictable if anyone had been willing to analyze them systematically. Over the following hours, as reinforcements arrived and the base was secured, the full scope of Bronte's actions became clear. She had single-handedly neutralized 12 insurgents, had coordinated the evacuation of wounded personnel from 3 separate locations, and had provided tactical guidance that saved the lives of numerous defending soldiers. The after-action reports documented engagement patterns that demonstrated sophisticated tactical knowledge, shooting accuracy that exceeded most qualified infantry soldiers, and decision-making under pressure that reflected advanced combat training. The evidence was undeniable that the weapons maintenance specialist had performed at a level that her supervisors had declared impossible. Major Harrison, recovering from wounds sustained during the initial assault, requested a full debriefing of her actions. The conversation took place in the same office where she'd been formally restricted from tactical activities just weeks earlier. "Robinson," Harrison said, consulting reports that documented her actions throughout the engagement. "Your performance during the attack raises serious questions about how we've been utilizing your capabilities." "Sir, I tried to indicate that I had additional training and knowledge that could be valuable to base operations. Those suggestions were considered outside my area of responsibility." Harrison studied the tactical analysis she'd prepared, comparing her threat assessments with the actual attack patterns the insurgents had used. The correlation was precise enough to suggest that her unauthorized studies had been more accurate than the official intelligence assessments. "Your tactical predictions were essentially perfect," he admitted. "You identified vulnerabilities that our official planning missed, and you developed countermeasures that proved effective when tested under combat conditions." The conversation that followed was unlike any she'd experienced during her deployment. Instead of being questioned about exceeding her assigned role, she was being asked to explain how her preparation had been so effective and why the command structure had failed to recognize her capabilities. "Robinson, I'm recommending you for immediate transfer to tactical operations. Your performance demonstrates qualifications that far exceed your current assignment, and this base needs personnel with your combination of technical knowledge and tactical capability." The transformation was immediate and comprehensive. Within days, she was assigned to the tactical planning staff, where her knowledge of base vulnerabilities and defensive procedures proved invaluable for improving security protocols. Her weapons expertise was expanded to include training responsibilities for personnel who needed advanced technical knowledge. Most importantly, her tactical insights were no longer dismissed as outside her area of expertise. The command structure that had restricted her activities now sought her input on defensive planning, threat assessment, and operational procedures. 6 months later, Bronte stood in the same briefing room where she'd once been relegated to equipment maintenance assignments. But now she wore the insignia of Tactical Operations Specialist, and when she spoke about security procedures and defensive planning, people listened with the respect that her expertise had finally earned. The key to effective base defense, she told the assembled personnel, is understanding that threats can come from directions that conventional planning doesn't anticipate. Our effectiveness depends on personnel who are prepared for scenarios that exceed their assigned roles. Her story had become part of Nightingale's operational tradition, cited as an example of how preparation and determination could overcome institutional limitations. The weapons maintenance specialist who had been dismissed as inappropriately ambitious had become the tactical operations specialist whose expertise was considered essential. The attack that had nearly destroyed the base had ultimately transformed it into a more effective defensive installation, led by personnel who understood that capability mattered more than assigned specialties. Bronte Robinson had proven that being ready for impossible situations was the difference between survival and disaster. As she concluded her briefing and watched new personnel taking notes on the lessons her experience had taught, Bronte reflected on the journey that had brought her from overlooked technician to respected tactical specialist. She'd spent 14 months preparing for a test that everyone said she'd never face, and when that test came, she had proven that preparation could overcome any limitations others tried to impose. The base that had once restricted her activities now depended on the capabilities they'd tried to suppress, and the soldier they'd kept from missions had become the leader who made sure everyone came home safely.